So thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome everybody. My name is TJ Kelly. I will be the moderator for today's discussion. And today's topic, as you can see here, is the state of mail security, dangerous mail incidents, and risk analysis. And joining us to discuss this topic today is our panel of experts. First is Mr. Will Plummer, our Chief Security Officer. Will is a 25-year U.S. Army veteran and explosives ordnance disposal expert. Also joined by Mr. Cody Martin, our Director of Mail Security. Cody is a former U.S. Postal Inspection Service federal agent who did 12 years in the Dangerous Mail Inspections Unit. And lastly, Dr. Alexander Sapok. Alex is our CEO. He holds MS and PhD degrees in mechanical engineering from MIT and has previously founded an MIT spin-out company in the field of advanced sensing. So thank you three gentlemen for being on our panel today. Before we dive in, a quick introduction to who we are. I think most on this call are pretty familiar already with RaySecur, but for anybody who are new to meeting us, we are world leaders in mail security, headquartered in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and experts in mail threat detection and real-time analysis and support. As the new standard in mail security, we support Fortune 500 companies, governments around the world, heads of state, and high-profile individuals. Briefly, here is a snapshot of our agenda for the day. We'll cover dangerous mail data from the US and around the rest of the world. We'll talk about some recent case studies and examples, highlighting threat types and targets and motivations, things of that nature. And we'll talk about combating dangerous mail attacks, what to do about the problem. And we will have time for question and answer session at the end, so please do bring in those questions in the Q&A box. We'll be happy to get around to those. Lastly, you'll hear us throughout today's discussion reference our annual report. You can see here, it covers official and open source data. This is what we're going to be talking about today, but there's much more detail in the report itself than we'll have time to cover on today's event, deep dive analysis and all that. So if you would like a copy of that report, please feel free to download it from the URL printed there. And we will also send out a link after the fact to all registrants of today's event, so you can download it there as well. So without further ado, I want to start with our CEO, Alex Sapok, to take us through some of the numbers on mail threat data. So Alex, take it away.
Thanks, TJ. I appreciate the introduction. So the first area that we'll take a look at when it comes to the report is a high-level overview of both US mail threat data and then position that within a global context. Before we dive into the data, I think it's important to understand where the data is coming from and understand how the data is collected and presented so that we can interpret it appropriately. Specific to data for mail threats in the United States, we've got two primary sources. The first being the United States Postal Inspection Service, USPIS, which is specific to mail threats and mail crimes, as well as a US bomb data center managed by the ATF for explosives related incidents. So those do a great job of providing us with very detailed granular data around specific mail threats. Another thing to keep in mind when we're looking at this data is two things. One is, reporting thresholds can vary with time. So, 5 years ago, things might have been categorized as one category that could have changed, or the threshold for actually being included in a report may have changed as well with time. So those are two things we want to keep in mind, both the threshold and then the categorization, the classification of those kind of events. And then finally, it's important to put that in a global context. Unfortunately, we don't have the same level of data that we have from the USPIS and BDC for other countries around the world. So if we look at things like Royal Mail, Deutsche Post, Interpol, we don't have that same level of granularity. But a couple of things that we can look at there are sort of global terrorism risk indices. And by making some general assumptions, we can make at least a relative comparison for the potential risks and threats in different countries around the world. And we'll talk through that in a bit more detail as well. Specific to our 2020 Dangerous Mail Report, there's really two key motivations for putting this report together. And this is, we've been doing this for a couple of years now. The first is today, there's really no single source for mail threat data. Different agencies are reporting things at different times and the data is a bit fragmented. So what we try to do here is pull together that data from the various agencies and provide really a kind of a one-stop shop or one source for that information. And then the second thing is that a lot of the official government statistics, there's typically a time lag between the events and when the data comes out, and that can range by as much as 6 to 12 months. So in the interim, we track mail threats based on open source data on a daily basis. And we include that data in the report as well. So you've got both the historical government figures plus the actual cases from 2020. So if we start to dive into that data, the first example that we'll highlight are the 2019 USPIS official numbers. The one number to kind of focus in on here is about 3,200, almost 3,300 suspicious incidents that were reported in 2019. So these met the threshold for reporting. They elicited some sort of response. They included liquid, powder, and other type of events. Within USPIS, you have 400 specially trained inspectors working in the dangerous mail unit that last year processed about 125,000 suspicious items through the forensics labs for a variety of reasons. Not all of those were threats. Some of those were crimes, fraud, and other activities. But it's really the 3,300 events, or about 10 per day. That's the number we want to keep in mind from the USPIS data. The other source of data that we have from an official capacity is US Bomb Data Center, or USBDC. Here, the number you want to hone in on is the 5,500, 5,482 suspicious or unattended package incidents last year. Again, going back to my earlier comment about categorization and reporting, this under the umbrella of package incidents, there's also included things like bags and backpacks and those sort of things as well. We have included links in the slides, and I think folks will have access to those. You can drill down to the primary source data and access all that detailed data here as well. In addition to the number of events, the two things I just wanted to highlight in terms of impact from those explosives events were about 78 injuries and 16 fatalities in 2019 as well. So now that we took a look at the US specific data, it's important to sort of view and interpret that in a global context. So what we're showing here is a snapshot of historical data that's pulled from the START database. This is managed by the University of Maryland, sort of one of the premier global terrorism databases that we have really a robust and objective data set to draw from. And although we just focus a lot on the North America, the US data, you can see that that's the tiny yellow line here in the historical data. And if you compare that just from a terrorism risk standpoint to the rest of the world, you can see that if we're concerned about mail threats in the US and North America, the rate of incidence or the prevalence is actually much greater in other parts of the world. So for a lot of folks joining this call today, you might be joining as part of a global organization. You've got sites both in the US, as well as Europe, Asia, Africa, et cetera. These are the things you want to keep in mind. If we highlight Europe, Western Europe, just as a specific example here, there's about 3 times greater risk for terrorism in general, of which mail plays a role, as opposed to just the US-centric and North American data that we looked at. If we drill down a little bit further, so we used, in this case, the global terrorism data as one proxy for mail threat and risk in other parts of the world. We can also look at another independent source of data here. This is also coming from the START database. But what we're just looking at here are the number of confirmed reports of mail-related bombings and explosive incidents around the world over the 2000 to 2017 time period. And what you see here, kind of the size of the circle over each country, is the total number of mail-related explosive incidents that met the START database thresholds for those countries. And again, if you compare the United States to UK, other parts of Europe, Middle East, and portions of Asia, you see that the prevalence there is significantly greater, again, on the order of magnitude, about 3 times greater than in the United States. And then lastly, if you want to drill down even further, we've provided links in all of the slides. You can actually access this primary source data. You can drill down to each of these little indicators here on the map. Each circle in this case is an actual event. So you can drill down to the event-specific information. Without going into too much detail, I just want to highlight the fact that most of these individual events are clustered around major economic centers, major urban centers, and centers of business around the world. And then finally, even though we just spent some time looking at sort of the historical numbers, if we look at the most current numbers that we have from a global terrorism risk standpoint, this is coming from IEP, which again sources a lot of their data from the START database. You see here sort of a relative heat map in terms of terrorism risk for the United States. And you can see just from a relative coloring standpoint where that puts the US risk in relation to other parts of the world as well. Again, sort of calling attention here to Western Europe, Asia, and other major business centers. So with that global view of the data, I'll pass it back to TJ and the panel to walk through some of the more specific 2020 results that we've compiled and a couple case studies.
Thank you, Alex. There is a lot of data in there. Again, just to reiterate that folks will have access to these slides and links to the primary sources after this event is over. And if you have questions on any of these, please do submit those in the Q&A box, and we will have time at the end to come back around for those questions. Next on our agenda, I'll throw it over to Will Plummer, our CSO, to take us through the most common threats observed in 2020. And Will, you have a different data source than Alex, right? These are open source incident reports, is that right? You want to take us through some of these numbers?
Yeah, much like the START database, we pull from open source. So there's really no one coalesced place in the world that you can go, hey, this is what is going to show up. For example, when you start talking about Western Europe, Interpol doesn't track suspect packages. MI5 doesn't do it. They don't release it openly. So we have to pull from what we get from the news and open source. So this year we saw a couple things increase. If you're looking at threat types, drugs increased throughout the 40 to 42% of what was shipped as a legitimate threat in the mail, their illicit activities. That's tied primarily to individuals that are no longer able to stand on the street corner. It's much easier if you can't be out in public just to drop it in a mailbox and have it delivered. Good example of that, earlier this year, an individual mailed 7,800 packages from their own post office or from their own mailbox full of drugs all across the United States. It's just, that's the way that the market moved to. White powder threats increased from 27% to 38%, tied primarily to the fact that you can shut down a company for about 50 cents. If you have something that's frustrating or some reason to reach out and you want to cause hate and discontent, that's a very quick and effective way to make it actually happen. Other powders that come through, those are caustic materials, things that people scent intending to hurt somebody, chlorine, powder, other elements. We look at it targets. This year increase was for 42% from about 30% for government. That's tied for a lot of frustrations people have both with the elections process. This is a very contentious year, and a lot of the facilities that would normally be benign were quickly identified as something that people could reach out and do something to. So polling facilities, election offices, they received an increase as well. The business and residence side, the 39% there, that's significant. So the number of residents targets that were hit this year increased because the amount of people are obviously not working in the office space anymore. You move from the corporate headquarters and you move your everything you work into the house, and instead of the corporate security and everybody protecting individuals that people wanted to reach out and affect, it was effectively their spouse picking up mail from the mailbox. Other two numbers that were significant this year were corrections and courts. So corrections places, those are illicit items, drugs normally going through. And then from 2 to 6% was courts this year, primarily at judges. People wanted to reach out and show displeasure with something that come through the court process. So those are the significant numbers, but basically the big one is white powders are increasing at about 42%. All right. If we're looking at containers, a lot of this has got smaller. So packages where you think of UPS or whatever, they're going to have a chain of custody. That's not where we're seeing most of these threats. So 95% of them come in small packages that can be mailed primarily to the United States Postal Service. Some of those are last mile, and we'll talk about that in a minute. 63% parcels, that's things generally less than 10 ounces and less than half an inch thick. 32% of letters were exactly that, letter sizes with 150 to 500 milligrams of powder aimed at particular individuals. Responses, hazmat team, well, after 2001, when the anthrax threats were sent out, you have to respond as if it's the worst case. That's who you're going to get to try to decontaminate most situations. Behind that, UD, bomb squad, and sheriff's department, these people do not respond alone. If the hazmat team shows up, we list that because they're the primary responder. Meant generally a chemical problem or a chemical threat. But the rest of them come with, we lost slides. Okay. We lost slides, TJ.
Part of doing these events live.
Yeah, I'll keep talking through it. So the rest of those events that showed up, those were a large response. You ended up having a full-blown everybody out there trying to deal with the problem. The big thing that comes out of this is the individuals involved. Next one, TJ. The individuals involved, those are the people that you're going to have to interact with on a daily basis. So we'll talk about this in the SOP process, how to best get through this and get to your desired end state. All right, next slide. All right, so like I mentioned, half an inch thick, less than 10 ounces. That's most of the threats that we've bumped into and we've collected up over the year, because there's no chain of custody. You could drop it into a collection bin, put 50 cents on the package in the form of a stamp, and end up shutting down a corporation. So that's kind of the goal of the in-state. Here, you look at some of like the poster 84 for USPS, where a lot of these events say that it's going to have, oily stains, uneven. There's going to be the normal traits. A lot of these events did not have that. There's a couple reasons why. Most of these threats are internal. People have been laid off. So they know who the CEO is. They know how to spell his name, and they know how to get it in. They know who the CFO is. They know where she works at. And a lot of these look like normal packages because people know the inner workings of these facilities. All right. So I mentioned that 50 cents is going to be the primary way that you're going to get this delivered through USPS. What's coming of age now is last mile style threat. That's because as we crowdsource getting all of these things to the end state or to the location we want to get at, we've got other people stepping in to close that gap. Last mile threats are effectively the same thing as an Amazon worker in their personal vehicle showing up in front of your house and putting a package down on the steps and then taking a picture with a cell phone. You know it's there because you get the image, but from the outside, that's just some random person walking up to a front porch. These are becoming more and more common, and it's probably something that is going to have to become really forward-thinking solutions to solve, because it is all over the place.
All right, well, thanks for the analysis of some of the stats and crowdsourced numbers and open source numbers, rather. So what I'd like to do now is bring in Cody and throw this into more of a discussion kind of conversation format as we take it through some case studies. So I'll walk through a few of those and I'll put it out to our two experts here to help us kind of interpret and analyze what we're seeing. So our first example is from a corporate headquarters that received a hoax powder, I believe it was in May of last year. Yep. Will, you've spoken about this in the past. What can you tell us about this event?
So this is a great example of how 50 cents can shut somebody down, right? Subway gets pulled out as a victim here, and they get effectively charged in the court of public opinion. So they laid off approximately 200 employees at their headquarters here in Connecticut early on in the pandemic. Whether that was tied to the pandemic or not doesn't make a difference. That's what the public opinion, or that's what the local news station said. There were approximately 20 people on site when it happened, and it shut down everything for several hours. That was it. It was a non-event. Essentially, it was locally reported. Hey, this happened, and no harm, no foul. Everybody's okay. Hazmat's taking care of it. FBI's taking a look. What comes out of larger news agencies is that it was tied to the firings. That wasn't an assessment made by anybody except a reporter. They brought up recent problems they've had, like Jared Fogle. That came to the forefront, even though that's been finished and completed in the courts. And the news agencies effectively blamed corporate. They came out and said, this is something that they caused on top of themselves. And that's not actually what happened. So that's kind of where some of the frustrations lie when you're trying to protect the corporate entity and it starts acting as somebody that, as an individual.
And so, Cody, I imagine you must have dealt with situations like this one, white powder events coming with the USPIS and dangerous mail unit. What does this mean to you when you see an event like this? What kind of alarm bells start ringing?
Sure. Well, even taking this scenario into play, outside of health and well-being, which this was a hoax, nobody was injured or there was no ill effects due to that. There was disruption due to downtime, and that's always a factor. But now we're dealing with kind of that third leg of the stool, which is the brand. And, when these things happen and you get into the news for whatever reason, as Will mentioned, these these collateral things get brought up as well, right? So now you're in the news cycle because of a benign, to some extent, powder event that did cause a disruption, but now you have this collateral to deal with. And not only that, but I've typically seen a rise in copycat type behavior. If in fact this was tied to an organization has layoffs and they have an event due to that, if it's large enough, you could see copycats wanting to replicate that. It's easy, right? There's an anonymous nature to it. It's easy to carry out, and by having this on the news, people get to see how much of a disruption it is, right? So those are the things that we want to take into consideration and plan to try to stay in front of them the best that we can.
That's all great info, and there's a lot of examples similar to that one. This one moves into the realm of government and politics. This is a woman, I believe, a Canadian woman, if I'm right on that, Will, who attempted to mail the poison ricin to the White House. So what can you tell us about this event?
Yeah, that was the culmination of a amount of or several steps that she took, reaching out and having frustrations with the Texas government because some of her family had some issues. You can see her tweet down here on the bottom right corner. I'm not going to read it out loud, but that goes in part with the letter that was sent to the White House that was maybe ricin, and she was caught at the border. We've all seen this one in the news, but this is a great example of things that escalate. I don't necessarily know what change she thought she could affect, but in her mind, she thought she could change the situation that she didn't agree with. It comes down to federal charges and being held in federal court, but the reality is some of this could have been caught ahead of time. It could have been handled before it ended up with a ricin letter hitting up to the White House.
Cody, you had talked about escalation before. You've seen events like that as well?
Yeah, I think escalation is a big one, and I talk about it often. And it makes me think back to probably the first bomb case I ever worked was kind of a picture of this. And there was a gentleman by the name of John Tompkins. He called himself the Bishop Bomber, right? And you could see his behavior over a period of a couple of years and how he escalated from one tactic to another. Just in a nutshell, he was trying to, he was basically using extortion, right? He was trying to get some sort of benefit by coercing various institutions and people to do something via him threatening them. He started by mailing letters to a couple of different financial institutions demanding stock prices be raised to a certain level so he could benefit from that financially, right? That didn't occur, obviously, because it doesn't make sense. Ultimately, he ended up mailing out about a dozen or so of these over a certain amount of time. Yep. And this was going to the institutions themselves, to owners, employees, their family members. He was threatening to kill coworkers and children, and he was escalating his tactics, right? He then moved into taking photos of their residences, including those in there as well, making it more personal to try to elicit a response from them. At the end of this 2-year period, he ended up mailing a couple of pipe bombs. That was his next step. And, that's when kind of everything come together. And, the important thing to take away here, if you're receiving threatening letters or anything of that nature, we need to be documenting that, at least internally. If it's not through law enforcement channels, that has to be recorded. There has to be a record of it, because oftentimes it points to something that's going to happen later down the road. So yeah, the threat escalation is definitely something that needs to be on the front burner and in your peripheral at least.
So on to our next example here. This one, Will, I think you had mentioned mail-in ballots. A lot of the, obviously much higher percentage of vote by mail happened in this past election. Cody, I'm going to throw this one to you over first. The one that jumps out to me is the Nebraska event on the bottom there. And as I understand it, this immediately elicited a federal response. So what can you tell me about, who goes first and what this event would have meant to you as a USPIS, inspector and agent?
Sure. Well, on any of these, oftentimes, depending on the magnitude of it, you're going to have multiple agencies that are working hand in hand. In terms of the U.S. postal inspectors and how they get involved with cases, as long as there is some nexus to the U.S. Postal Service, to the mail stream, they are going to be able to get involved, and they often do. Now, like was mentioned earlier in terms of reporting, who the agency that pops up in the news, that there's no rhyme or reason to that necessarily a lot of times. So a lot of times it's going to be collaborations and there's going to be multiple agencies involved. But if there's a nexus to the U.S. Postal Service, the inspection service is going to have some jurisdiction there. And regarding these particularly, things were being transmitted through the mail, which is obviously enough to warrant a response, and then it just expands from there depending on what's carried out.
And so, Will, the blue liquid and electric pump, that sticks out to me as unique, different, not your typical threat. You're an EOD tech, you see electric pump on there. What does that mean to you?
It was a dry run. He was trying to see what would happen when you put the real, not necessarily a real threat, but something inside on election day. So check the screening standards and what people are actually doing. It's just a test run is what he ended up getting caught on. So
in this case, caught thanks to that test run and therefore avoided a more serious incident in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. He was trying to contaminate as many ballots as he could get his hands on or get his device next to. So.
All right, our next example, we do have a few more here. This one targeted a private citizen, right? So we move out of the realms of corporate and government and political officials into just somebody who lives on Main Street, USA. So what were the details on this case, Will?
So the individual had a last mile threat placed on their front porch about 5 o'clock in the morning. Mother picks up the package, carries it in the house, puts it on the kitchen table, and it sits there for the entire day. About 5 p.m., the individual comes home, takes the package in their bedroom, opens it up, and ends up having the device detonate in their lap. In the hospital, not dead, but targeted primarily due to what appears to be drug or gang-related activity. But the reality is mom thought this was legitimate and viable. Mom thought this was completely okay and walked around it for an entire day because of how it was delivered. It shows up on the front porch. It must be legitimate. Somebody means to give us this. So it's a fantastic example of, hey, even at the house, you need to make sure you're screening your mail, but make sure you know where the mail streams are coming from and where things are, where they're coming from.
Mm-hmm. So, you talk about the motivation, if that was a criminal or illicit activity. There's obviously, we hear a lot of news about, the extremism out there, ideological motivation. So there's a lot of examples of these. If you could run down a few of the details in high profile cases, Will. So
these increased through the year. And you kind of watch them grow and evolve throughout the pandemic. So one of the first ones is on the individual on the top right. Basically, a church was refusing to shut down due to the pandemic. California was a little late to make it a mandate, and some of the local people inside this community believed that church should have been shut down. And their answer when the pastor chose not to do it was to put a device at the front door. Again, last mile threat, walked up, placed it where it was pretty obvious, and they expected for it to get news coverage. That was the intent. It happened, the statewide mandate for shutdown happened anyway, but federal charges for the individual that placed the package in front of it. The letters on the bottom, we saw an increase throughout this year through racist events, people with problems with other organizations, NAACP, that's the letters that are listed here, but a lot of Asian markets and a lot of people who have businesses are being targeted because of people's political beliefs or misconceptions. Those are going to continue, we think, and it's going to become worse throughout the next year until the world kind of gets a little more settled. So we've talked about the illicit material a few times. It's not all, bad actors trying to kill or maim, right? There are other, I wouldn't call them legitimate, but other common uses of the mail that don't really belong in there. So Cody, I see a lizard pictured here. What are some of the things you've seen in your days with the USPIS? Any and all reasons why people would be sending contraband or other materials that they should not be through the mail?
No, there's a lot of times no reason to be sending some of the things that they send, right? Yeah, we've seen it all, and it's one of those things where very few people are familiar with the old domestic mail manual, which regulates everything that's mailable and the restrictions and how to do it and all of that. So you see a little bit of everything, and a lot of times there are people out there with bad intent, right, that mail stuff that they have a specific purpose with that. And then you have people that mail things that just are not paying attention, ignorant to what they're doing. I don't know how you want to describe that, but these can be benign and nothing, non-threatening, or they can be items and substances that absolutely are harmful and can cause a lot of damage, but they just aren't thinking about it. So it is a problem. And when it comes down to it, especially the illegal stuff, we're always talking about it. It's a manpower versus a mail volume type scenario. And when we look at the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, around 1,200 agents, 400 of those, give or take, in the DMI program. And then you compare that to the U.S. Postal Service, who's processing and delivering over 470 million mail pieces a day. That's a large gap. So, there's a misconception that the Postal Service screens everything, and that when you receive something, it's 100% safe and there's no worries there. And that's just not the case, right? So the burden falls on the end user, in my opinion, and taking your own safety into your own hands. And I say it all the time, and TJ, you make fun of me a little bit from time to time, but nobody cares about your safety as much as you do. And that's true. So, people need to be taking steps to just pay attention at the least, and then put other protocols and procedures in place to address those problems if they were to show up.
Right. And finally, we do want to bring this back to a global focus, right? Will, you had highlighted a few of these threats, some of them very recent, right?
Yeah, so a couple of them that we'll just talk about real quick. AstraZeneca, they had a suspect package get sent in to their facility that's producing the vaccine from an anti-vaxxer. So you need to really pay attention, because some of these facilities they appear to be benign, right? You wouldn't think that a facility producing anything medical related would be significant, but Canada's been hit 6 times in the last 4 months for white powder events at facilities that are either doing testing, building testing capabilities, or looking to figure out a vaccine. They're generally low threat, but become very high threat in times of stress. 3 devices went off last week in Germany, and they just arrested the individual that was responsible for it. The one we listed here is Lidl. They had 3 people injured when a device went off in their mailroom. But there was the one the day before it that went off in a beverage production facility. They make everything from Capri Sun to some alcoholic beverages. And the one that was caught on Thursday, the third one, was caught at an airport, but it was in transit. The individual picked up, had little to no interaction with those 3 companies. And those 3 companies are independent. So it's not like they were tied together. We're waiting to see what's coming of that. But that's the type of thing that's going on around us today. So it's important to pay attention to these events.
Mm-hmm. All right, so with all the kind of doom and gloom of setting the stage of what the state of mail security looks like today and what some of those examples and case studies are, we're going to move into some practical solutions, some good news. Cody's going to take us through what you can do about it and how to, as you put it, Cody, nobody cares more about your own safety than you do. So how folks can implement their own safety measures and security protocols to protect themselves, life, limb, and property. Before we move on, I do want to remind everyone that we're going to have time to come back to questions at the end. So if any of the stats and descriptions that our experts are providing today are raising questions for you, please do throw those into the Q&A box, and we'll come back to those in just a moment. So without further delay on this, Cody, can you take us through some of the practical solutions?
Sure. Yep. One of the things, if I've talked to you before, or if you've seen any of our presentations, we really emphasize our 5 pillars of mail security, and we do that for a reason. It's a holistic approach that we believe offers the most comprehensive solution to a lot of the things that we see. And as you can see here, that consists of people, procedures, training, technology, and emergency response. And we believe each one of those needs attention. And if not, if there's a gap there, you're really not putting forth your best effort to solve the problem that we've been discussing all day today. And the good thing is, a little bit of work on each of these can really set you up, and it can give you a good framework to move forward on. So we just want to make sure that people know that, hey, we want to address all 5 of these pillars and make sure that we have things in place to adequately support each one of those. As we're doing this, a couple of the resources that we recommend folks rely on just for some background and also to kind of lay the groundwork are the global mail security standards that have been put in place by the sources that you see here on the screen. The good thing about this is that it's available for you to look at. You can read through there. You can look at the best practices that they recommend. And, a lot of these are based on historical events, things that have happened, bad things that have happened. And responses have been crafted to those over the years. So those are good resources to look at if you're starting from scratch and you're just trying to get your mind wrapped around what sort of solution may work for you, what things to consider, and things of that nature. So we always recommend starting there at the minimum, just to kind of get a grasp of how to start tackling this problem. A couple of the things, especially if I've met with you before, I spend a lot of time helping people with SOPs, processes and procedures. And these are really critical in dealing with mail-borne threats. They help set policy and standards and training, which is a very critical component of that. They establish your screening processes. They help provide guidelines for suspicious items and how to handle those, whether we escalate, de-escalate, how do we navigate that problem. And, whenever I'm meeting with folks, or if you've never looked at this, and it's your first time, there are a few questions you really want to kind of ask yourself to get started. What is your current screening process? Is it documented? Because that needs to be something that's looked at carefully. You need to think about, do you have procedures outlined that help you address suspicious items when they come in? Do people know what to do? Has that been thought about ahead of time? When it comes to emergency response, is your answer to call 911? And if that's your only option, we need to take a look at that, right? Because that is an option, but it's not the only one. And there's some other steps that you could take in the intermediate. And then it's like, can you accommodate multiple sites, multiple locations? If you have a global footprint, if you have executive protection program, how does your mail security protocols support that, or do they at all, right? It may be an afterthought. So you just want to ask yourself these types of things. And then, really the big takeaway is like, this particular preparation really helps maintain standards regardless of, where your location is or what kind of situation that you're exposed to. So be sure that you're spending some time developing those and making sure they're documented. Part of that is understanding your risk. And, this is a definition put out by DHS, and I think it really kind of summarizes what we're looking at here. You can't provide a solution to something if you don't know what the risk is. And there's kind of three components to that, according to DHS. The threat would be one of those. What kind of threats are you potentially exposed to? What is out there? What's happening? What's going on? Vulnerability. When you're looking at those threats, how vulnerable are you to being exposed or subject to one of those? And then the consequence. What is the consequence if those two things come together and something does happen? And you combine all of that and you really get a good picture of what your risk is, maybe overall as an organization, but you may have independent sites that have different risk levels as well. So you really need to work through that methodically, figure out what your risk profile looks like, and then adjust as you need to. And keep in mind, that can change weekly or daily depending on what's going on. So you have to keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening within the mail security industry, and then respond, escalate or de-escalate as needed, and you're working through that process. As we've mentioned in a few of these scenarios, revenge is one of the largest motivators for these types of attacks. And it is one of those that, again, you can kind of, if you're paying attention, you have a much better chance of addressing those as they're coming up. Are you receiving those letters early on that are making, what we consider idle threats at various people or departments? Are you going through major layoffs and all of a sudden there's a reason for somebody to, quote, get even with the company or a person in HR, whoever that may be? Keeping an eye on these and, really documenting, I would say, keeping a person of interest or an incident file where you can document this type of stuff with pictures and all of that type of thing is critical in trying to prevent these things before they occur. And that's just one of the ways that we can, head that off ahead, before something does pop up that we have to respond to. And then, of course, when we talk about having to respond to something, right? We're big proponents of you maintaining control of these situations as long as you can. Now, we're not going to neglect safety and put people at risk inadvertently to do that, but we want to make sure that you're making the right decisions and calling the right people at the right time. Because once you turn one of these over to first responders or an entity like that, you have turned over control, and often you're sitting outside the wire watching things unfold with no input whatsoever. So having plans set up, having procedures set up, making local contacts, having training that establishes a lot of these things, maybe doing cooperative training with local responders, things of that nature is going to help you be set up for success. And you can see on the screen, 2 different responses from 2 different entities and possibly the same type of scenario. I've seen them both for a white powder event, right? 1 person, 1 vehicle, go in and screen it, it's cornstarch. You know, the entire cavalry shows up, they go in and screen it, it's cornstarch. So thinking about that ahead of time and trying to lay out things in a practical manner that helps you control that as much as possible is another huge takeaway and kind of the culmination of all this planning that you put into place.
Thanks, Cody. I imagine that you know, being outside the wire and watching things unfold is one of the last things any security team is going to want to have happen for their facility. So, Will, can you take us through, you know, some closing the gap here, some of the, you know, the conclusions on some of these things?
Yeah, one of the things, Cody's point is critical that everybody kind of leans into it. Understanding where the desired end state is, knowing that you have to go through an event to get there, and the best way to navigate that process. That is critical. What happens is a lot of companies, organizations, or facilities just haven't ever done that mental exercise, and that mental exercise can save you a lot of pain when it happens. The numbers are important to know. Those are critical. They do reinforce what we think. 10 times a day on average, that's going to be a low number. That's what's reported externally. That's what's caught in the news. That's not capturing every single event. That's just the reality of the world. Need to consider the aggregate versus isolated individual events. So I say that because a lot of people we talk to don't necessarily identify, hey, this is a problem in mass. They think this is a one-time event, it's not going to happen again. Well, it'll happen again to you at some point, but it's happening to multiple people. These aren't isolated events. There's something that the world's going to have to deal with. Combating threats, understanding your organization's risk profile, that, as Cody mentioned, will change based on where your situation, what situation it is, where you sit on a particular topic. We talk to clients all the time who are reassessing, hey, nobody really knew who we were 6 months ago. Now we're pretty well known, and we've got some people that are pretty frustrated with us. And understanding that will change, you need to react and respond accordingly to it. Advanced planning and countermeasures, that's really, really critical to getting after that problem, trying to get you to that desired end state. There are tools you can put in place ahead of time. There are people that you can train. There are emergency action procedures that are just become immediate action drills that you can do that really will mitigate the problem when it becomes to the forefront, when it really shows up. So that it's important to plan ahead. And this is what we're talking about doing, and you're here listening to us talk about it. So hopefully everybody's working that way.
Thanks, Will. So just to reiterate for our attendees today, this data is coming out of our 2020 annual report. That report is available for download in the URL you see here. We will also send links to everybody around. But I would like to now get to a bunch of the questions that have been piling up. So we have a number of those, so we'll dive into a few of them. And what I'll do is I'll read them out to our panelists here and kind of throw it out to the general public. So first question is, why is it that CSOs seem to dismiss the risk of mail security in their risk assessment? I think we've talked a number of times about how security teams are very, very good at assessing physical security risk on all areas, and then sometimes mail gets skipped. We don't think of that. So Cody, can you dive in first on that? When you work through SOPs, what do you hear about, and what are some of those teams thinking?
Yeah, I can't speak for CSOs, right, in particular, but I think a lot of the gap that we look at, and this is across the board, regardless of position or title, is there's a unfamiliarity with it, if that makes sense, right? It's something that's new and it's kind of weird, and a lot of people just don't know how to address it. And the reality of it is, you know, until you've gone through those or been exposed to it or have dealt with those situations, there's really not a lot of information to draw from in terms of how-tos, right? We see incidents all the time. We see the culmination of event, and we get that information on the news and print, but we have little information that's available to the public, everything leading up to it and the steps and how things played out and the details of that. So, you know, I think it's just something that there's just not a lot out there. You can't really find much about it. So it's hard to address that when there's not a large pool of information to draw from.
Yeah, let me add on that real quick. So like, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to ignore a problem. I don't think that's how CSOs are looking at this. I think it's, to Cody's point, not something that's highlighted very often. And it's something that takes effort, and you only have so much that you can do during a day. There's only so much money, so much time, and so much energy. And unless it gets prioritized inside the organization or facility higher than what it currently is, it's probably going to continue to be ignored. And that's just the reality of it. There's other doors that have problems as well, but it's the one that is currently catching the most attention.
All right, here's a question about the U.S. Postal Service in general. There's actually two questions in here. The first is about mail volume. The person asking this question is wondering if volume has increased or decreased lately. And there's some other, if so or if not, what does that mean to privatizing mail carrying, and should that be a viable option? Should we move in that direction as corporations? But Cody, I'm going to throw to you on this one. I know you've been out of the USPIS for a little while, and of course that's a distinct organization from the USPS. But with your experience, can you give us some thoughts on what the mail volume might look like in this year versus the year before and the year before that, and kind of give us some thoughts there?
Yeah, I think I haven't looked at the numbers, so it's total speculation here, right? I think that numbers have shifted, and there's been a marked change there. The letter mail and things of that nature, my belief is has gone down. Package deliveries, parcels have gone up in some areas, right? But overall, there are issues with that. When it comes to privatization, that's kind of that's a controversial topic in and of itself, and one of those things that I don't think that there's an answer to it. I don't know that, in my opinion, I think that would be something that would be hard sell and hard to change, because the Postal Service being a quasi, they're self-funded, but they do have government regulation, right, and they're required to deliver, in essence, to every address in the United States. A private company wouldn't necessarily have that requirement, I don't believe. So, there would be some nuances there. And I think you are seeing things shift around. There's private couriers, you're seeing things that are moved, and certain volumes have been dislocated to different entities. But, it's just going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I don't think that's going to be anything that's near term, but we'll see what the future holds.
So perhaps as a spin-off of that question, there's a related one here about detection capabilities of some of those private groups and the third parties. Recognizing that we don't work for Amazon, DHL, UPS, FedEx, I don't have intimate knowledge of that. I'm not sure if any of our experts do either. But can we give any sort of general direction of detection capabilities for some of these private companies? What have you heard them talk about, or do you know anything along those lines, Cody?
Yeah, I'll speak on that for a second. The detection capabilities vary, right? So within the inspection service, if you're looking at that agency, they've got a lot of equipment that can do a lot of stuff. It's not being applied broad scale. It's not volume, the mass of mail coming through every day is not being subjected to this technology. There are things, right, because of events in the past, take 2001, certain biologicals like anthrax may be screened for on a limited scale, depending on what type of mail and things that are coming through. In terms of the other major carriers, there's just not a lot going on either. And, not that they don't have certain things that they can utilize in terms of technology, but when you just look at, again, mail volume as a whole, I don't believe there's going to be a solution that can be implemented that'll catch, the things that we need to be worried about on a large scale.
So there's a question here about, for Will, you had talked about how workforces, in the pandemic have largely distributed to home offices. So what information do we have about how a CEO or some other, VIP for a company, how people might be finding out the home address of some of these folks? And then what other guidance can a company provide for its distributed workforce that's now working from home? If you put your your CSO hat on for one of these companies, what are you thinking for that level of security?
Well, there's a couple things to that question. One, keeping their home address private, it's going to be really, really hard to do. I mean, that you can get anything on the internet, and even buying a house through proxy third party, people know where everybody lives at, right? So that means you need to implement physical protection procedures. So that's we got clients that are screening all the mail, regardless of what it is, at corporate, and then hand carrying it, transferring it off to the CEO's home. They're going through, and C-suite is having the EP teams checking things before it ever enters the house, having them transfer all the private mail, everything, to the office space, and then having the teams look at it there. It's the physical separation of the threat from the location of the individuals and who lives there is what you need to do. And if you're worried about it, if you can't put a screening process in place, that's the next step, is a separate physical location for you to get to those people. Now, if everybody else that's involved in that company, how to just make sure that they understand what their threats are, what to look at, what to identify, what to leave on the front porch, and what procedures they can do to protect themselves. Things like mail is inherently dirty. Even at your home, if you start looking at work stuff and you don't know where it's coming from, put gloves and a mask on. Mask is easy nowadays. Everybody's got one. But protect yourself at least a little bit before you bring stuff to put on the kitchen table.
I'm going to combine two questions here, and thanks for those answers, Will. There's a question about a resource for finding screening equipment that can cover powders and liquids. And I'm going to combine that with another question that said X-ray versus millimeter wave, that X-ray can't see powders and liquids, but millimeter wave can. Is that accurate? And if so, what does that mean for detection? So Alex, if I could throw this one to you as our technical expert here, I don't know how much you want to take us through the capabilities of millimeter wave and how that differs from X-ray, but specifically how that relates to powders and liquids and how those two kind of compare against each other.
Yeah, I'm definitely happy to. So to answer the first question on terms of resources, I think we highlighted two in the slide deck, one being the Homeland Security guidelines for mail screening, and the other being the UK PAS 97 guidelines. So both of those lay out a framework for screening requirements based on the organization, the facility, and some recommended best practices and tools to accomplish that. And really, I see technology as a tool. It's a tool, to achieve or to do a certain task or job. And what you'll see if you quickly, refer to those guidelines is the fact that there's a big screening gap. We talked about a number of different threats today, liquids, powders, and particularly powders being some of the most prevalent. And one of the reasons they're the most prevalent is they get through existing screening technologies. So we know we have a technology gap. The most prevalent technology to address the second question has been X-ray. X-ray has been around for over 100 years. It's a very known technology, probably the best known technology for seeing inside of something. It's hard to say seeing inside without saying X-ray vision or X-ray imaging. So it's known. It's, as I think most people know, it's high energy. It uses radiation to see through items. So it does a great job of seeing through, very large, thick items like metal to give you a very clear image through, those types of large items. The downside to X-ray, because it's so powerful, it typically blasts through the small, what we call the soft items, things like powders and liquids, especially in small quantities that you see in mail, tend to become invisible with typical X-ray screening. And if you combine that with the way that we're doing a lot of the screening today is, people are, screening bins of mail, for example, those small threats are getting missed. So that leads us to millimeter wave imaging, which is really a very new form of imaging using high frequency radio waves. So this is about 100 times higher in frequency than your cell phone or your Wi-Fi is operating at. And those frequencies have unique properties that it behaves somewhat like radio waves. It's completely safe. There's no radiation, but it allows you to see inside of items in real time. And most importantly, it's very good at seeing those soft items. So relative to X-ray, it's about 300 times more sensitive to see things like powders and liquids in small quantities. So when you're thinking about the threats and going back to Cody's discussion of risk, think about the threats that the mail stream presents to your organization, and then think about the type of tool that's needed to address that threat. You think about sledgehammer is a great tool for driving a tent stake in the ground, probably not the tool you want to use when you're hanging a picture in your house. So it's the same thing here in terms of finding the right tool to address the right threat. And in the case of powders, liquids, mail-borne threats, millimeter wave is an ideal tool to tackle those kind of threats.
It's a great answer, Alex. Thank you. I'm sure that there are some others who are new to millimeter wave. If there are other follow-up questions, please feel free to throw those in. We'll come back to it as they come in. One question here is about types of explosives. So, Will, this might be right in your wheelhouse.
Yep.
Do you have any data or just any historical, anecdotes you can throw at us? Anything about the most common types of explosives being used, either in mail or elsewhere, both globally versus just here in North America? I don't know how much data you have on all that, but what can you speak to in terms of common, explosive threats?
All right, the most common one you're going to see in the States is black powder or smokeless powder. They put it in a confined, pipe bomb. You can detonate a pipe bomb with simple what you pull out of a regular bullet. Behind that, there's going to be pyrotechnics. People pull off of fireworks. That's easy way to get extremely explosive material into a package form. Overseas, it depends what's generally available, but if you're looking for devices, for example, the ones in Germany this week, those are high explosive. I saw one little note and saw one picture, and I would take a guess that it's some small amount of plastic explosives or some small amount of high energetic material. The problem is getting your hands on stuff and the availability. So the most likely things you're going to see is what's most commonly available. So that's smokeless powder, pyrotechnics, and if you look at almost every other item out there, it's controlled. Now, if you look regionally towards Las Vegas, there's a lot of blasting in that part of the world. Dynamite's more readily found. I ran 20 incidents out in the desert where people were making IEDs with dynamite, and several instances where they get mailed. It just really depends on what's available to the individual that's trying to send a threat.
It's a great question and a great answer. Thank you. There's a question here about the technology for screening versus using like a canine team, for example. And this basically just a preference question for the experts on the panel here. But are there advantages of one over the other? And do you personally have a preference between canines and technology, or a combination thereof? So Will, I'll start with you on that, and then Cody, I would like to hear your answer too.
Yeah, so I like dogs. Canines are great. But they do perform a particular task. There's certain things they're hard with dogs. They get tired. They do have a little bit of a miss rate, depending on how good they are, how well trained they are, and how up to date they are with what you want them to do. The really good thing about dogs is you can clear a large area and quickly and without much effort. So you have a canine team and you think the suspect package gets called in, you can clear that area in a very short period of time. Vice going through and doing it with handheld human beings, touching everything and flipping things over. So I like them, but they have a particular place and time for use.
Yeah. Cody, do you have any experience to agree or disagree with Will?
No, absolutely. I use canines my entire career. It's just a component, right? All of these tools have their shortcomings, and I think that you're going to have, depending on the dog, again, the training, you're going to have good success finding narcotics, explosives, things of that nature. The problem is going to be, say, if you are looking for powders and maybe it's a hoax, right? It's flour inside. A dog may not hit on that, probably will not hit on that, but that is still going to cause a disruption that is going to elicit a particular response because we don't know what it is. So, there's downfalls to every type of solution. In the perfect world, we'd have all of these things and we could address everything, but that's just not the case, right? So dogs are awesome, but just like technology, there's going to be some gaps there that need to be filled with other tools.
That's a great answer, to kind of combine them whenever possible. And the point about flour is a really good one I hadn't considered. I appreciate that. There's a question here about the value in letting it be known to your employees or people in your organization how much of your preventative efforts are you putting in. Let them know their mail is being screened or whatever other attempts are in there in order to dissuade or prevent any sort of incident. So how overt versus covert should our screening procedures be? And I know we've talked about this as a company on a few past events, but Will, you have thoughts on the matter?
Absolutely. You should let people know, both internally and externally, that you're screening mail. It's hardening the target. Even if it's just the perception of the facility having steps and procedures put in place to stop bad things from happening, that perception works. It will stop people. Hardening a target is a very good idea. And with the reality that a lot of these threats are rotating towards insider, that's good. People need to know that they're being checked. That helps out.
Cody, do you have follow-up thoughts on that?
Yep, I totally concur. And I would say, just to kind of add on that, it adds peace of mind to employees, right? Especially if you are screening everything and they know that mail piece that they get has been looked at. It can really help whenever, even if things are happening within other organizations or on the news, depending on where you work in the organization, if you're a higher risk entity, that always amps people up a little bit and they're concerned there. So having that in place, it has kind of that double benefit of prevention and then also kind of that, employee support component.
Yeah. So there's a question here that goes to the escalation topic from earlier. And I do want to be respectful of folks' time. We're at about an hour here. So thank you everyone for hanging on to this point. We have 2 or 3 more to go through. So please do stick around. So we only have 2 or 3 more, but the next one here is about if someone is sending or receiving hoaxes in the mail continuously. If you're the recipient of that, what do you do about that? Do you need to pay attention to that on a regular basis? How do you handle it? But if you're on the receiving end of multiple hoaxes, what should your next steps be? So Cody, I want to go to you first on this.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely don't toss those to the wayside, right? That's something. I mean, law enforcement needs to be involved. That needs to be stopped. And when it comes to prosecution, whether it is a hoax or not, oftentimes the sentencing is going to be about the same. So I've had multiple cases over the years. They had no intent of killing or hurting anyone, but they sent a powder to cause major disruptions, and they did it over and over and over. And that's a problem because you're again, it's affecting people, the psychological effect there, the waste of resources with first responders, especially depending on the magnitude of these. So it does need to be documented early on. It needs to be addressed early on. And, we don't want to allow that to continue to happen. So be sure to stay on top of those type of events.
So somewhat related to that, this question is about if mail's being sent to residents, right? If somebody's working from home and there's a threat sent to the residents, if you call 911 from your home, even if it's a work scenario under other circumstances, what's the policy there? What's the procedure? Which agency would generally be alerted from that residential 911 call? And what does it look like to do it from home as opposed to from the office? So I don't know if this would be a Cody or a Will topic.
I hit a little version of it, and the reality is it depends completely on where you are and what facilities are in your area. So like all the ones that we looked at this year, when I made a comment earlier about, hazmat, 27, 38%, that's who took control of the situation. That's who handled it. But that escalated up to that team. A lot of the places in the world that we live in don't have a hazmat team. If you live out, 25, 30 miles from any major city, or you live in the suburban areas, they might not have somebody that can handle that. We talked to 2 election facilities this year that one of them had to call a hazmat team, and it took a day and a half to get the team out there to effectively take a look at what they seem to be a threat. So it's regional based on where you are and what the SOPs are in your area.
So last question, and again, thanks everyone for sticking on over the hour mark here. Last question goes back to technology. So Alex, I might bring you back in to close us out here. Are there any emerging advances in the millimeter wave technology to enhance imaging quality or help improve efficiency of screening process? What can you foresee on the horizon of new advances in millimeter wave technology?
Yeah, great question, TJ. So there's a couple things. When we think of technology at a high level, a lot of it comes down to performance versus cost, right? And I think we're familiar with that with the technology that we use in our daily lives. Millimeter wave inherently is dependent on frequency. So as we increase the frequency, we increase the resolution and the detail of what we're able to see. So with millimeter wave systems, as you go up to higher frequency systems, you're able to see much finer detail and get what I would say is X-ray-like imaging quality with a millimeter wave system at a high frequency. Today, we are sort of on the cutting edge of millimeter wave imaging technology, so that does come with a cost, but we can certainly expect that cost curve to come down as the technology advances. On top of that, there is a lot today that can be done with image processing to enhance imaging resolution and AI-based approaches for detection. And then I think if we take a step back and we say, certainly the resolution is nice, and we all, we're used to seeing our 4K screens on our iPhones, and it's great to have that clarity. At the same time, in order to, detect specific threats, if we're able to detect the threat, is the tool good enough to do its job? So I think those are the questions we want to ask ourselves. There's plenty of headroom on the tech front to keep advancing resolution. And then at the end of the day, it's really, what do we need to do to detect and catch these threats before they make it through?
Thank you, Alex. Appreciate the detail on that. So that closes out our last question. If you do have other follow-ups that you'd like our team to answer, please feel free to send them to us. You can see our contact information here, and we'll be sure to get you an answer from one of our panel of experts. And again, thank you everybody for joining us. Gentlemen of the panel, thank you for your time this afternoon and for educating the audience here. And so again, lastly, please do follow up with us if you have any other needs or questions on the matter, and we'll be in touch. So thanks everybody for joining, and I wish everybody have a great day.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.